Greetings, YouTube. This is Remarkable Republican here to bring you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. I've been on a research spurt lately looking into the fraud committed by Japanese gaming companies and the kinds of theft jobs they did in the 90s against American consumers. Previously, I uncovered how the NES and SNES are effectively the same system with a little bit of rearrangement of a few of the internal parts. It turns out it's actually worse than that, as we'll see next week. But for now, let's talk about how Sega copied Nintendo and pulled off something very similar when it came to the Master System and Sega Genesis, because it turns out that they really released 6 marks of the same console. And that is something I will prove. The difference between the Master System and Genesis is a technique known in the industry as goosing, which I will be fully exploring. The other thing that I will lay out is that the difference between 8-bit and 16-bit is actually just industry insider gobbledygook, which really doesn't mean very much when you actually understand how these things work. Sega released the same console from 1983 until 1994, multiple times over. And it began in 1983 with the SG-1000. This was the first ever Sega home console, and the idea was to have a home console machine. Unfortunately, there were a couple problems. One, Sega only could put their own games on it, but it was capable of running all of them. The other problem was that, although it was a powerful piece of machinery, and it was actually stronger than the NES, it had a problem with format, because it used these little chits like the Switch uses. So not only are these easy to lose and hard to keep up with, but also they don't have very much ROM on them. And so without having a lot of ROM, the games are pretty limited, and you can't actually take advantage of all the power in the hardware. So, in theory, this is more than capable of running almost any arcade game from before 1983, but in practice, you can't run them very well because the cartridges or the little chits are so small and inadequate. I feel like Nintendo was a lot more greedy re-releasing the NES as the SNES, but with Sega, the SG-1000 was a commercial flop, nobody bought it, and there were some serious design flaws. So reconfiguring it to be the Master System is pretty acceptable. The Master System could still read the old chits, but also now could read cartridges. So it was a reconfiguration to make sure everything actually worked as it should. The new cartridge was actually a fine design. Now, it was square, which as we'll see is not ideal, and it's also not as tall as the NES cartridge, but because it has about the same width, that means the connectivity is good. And one thing that Sega's really good at, as we'll see, is electrical current flow. That is their special power. And that already starts here with the Master System, because even though this system doesn't use much energy, it still has a lot of data coming out of the cartridge. And so, although this thing is running on very little power, it actually has good graphics and speed, and overall has more power than the NES, at least in terms of what it looks like on the screen. So it's a very impressive technical feat, and it shows that Sega was working with a very well-designed piece of hardware. However, part of the reason why it could get away with having so little electricity is because it didn't have some of the things the NES had, like 3D capability in the CPU, or the Rob the Robot connectivity. And part of that is that Sega was afraid that it wouldn't sell well enough, and so they only powered it with a cheap power source, and it could only run 4.25 watts, compared to 8 watts for the NES. So that was a bit of a problem. And going forward, they would need to correct that. But it is amazing what they were able to do with so little power. It's also kind of a mystery why they chose to use so little power when their main rival was using nearly twice as much. but that's a mistake that Sega would fix. In Brazil, the Master System sold really well and remained popular for a long time. The power grid in Brazil is really poor, and so the Master System, with its low energy use, was very much successful there. It didn't trip too many breakers. But elsewhere in the world, people were looking for a more premium experience, and so the Master System was another flop. Sega was looking to get it right the third time, and so they decided to design something that was more powerful. Now, what they do, though, is they are determined to take advantage of the excellent architecture of the SG-1000 and Master System. So what they do is they just reconfigure all of this one more time, but this time do put in a few different chips to upgrade it. So effectively, what they do between Master System and Genesis is exactly what Nintendo does between NES and SNES. But Sega actually does it first, and Nintendo steals their idea. So I'm not saying that it's honorable to really screw over consumers in this way by giving them the same thing they already own, but Sega did it first. And so at least they're a little bit more creative than Nintendo, even if both companies are Japanese criminals and Yakuza. So what did Sega do to create the Genesis? Well, one of the big things they want to do is use the same CPU, which is a really good unit, but make it bigger. And so they made it twice as big. And if you look at the sides of it, there are little strips on it that help hold it down, but also have connectivity with the rest of the motherboard. The bigger chip has 16 of those. The smaller one on the Master System has 8. That's what the bits mean. So all of that talk about the 16-bit revolution is just literally, here's a bigger chip. So that's all that means. And I mean physically bigger. The other thing they decided to upgrade was the sound card. So the earlier sound chip was ultra cheap. This time they decided to go with something that can play cool, trendy things like techno and rock really well. So they put that in there. As far as the cartridges, there is a clever redesign. They're about the same size, maybe a bit smaller than the Master System cartridges. But even though that would be a problem because these cartridges are a lot smaller than NES and SNES, Sega figured something out about electric flow. And that thing they figured out is that if you round the top of the cartridge, then electricity flows more smoothly throughout, and it breathes more easily. So it's kind of like using the principle of the arch to get greater strength, and also to make energy flow. So that makes up for the smaller cartridge size. One weird thing is that most other components are basically just the same, but actually to make sure this thing wasn't too much of a power hog, they actually downgrade the controller ports, and they actually use some surplus Atari 2600 ports. Which is a weird thing because the controller that they use for Genesis is actually more advanced than the one for Master System. It has an additional button. So this wasn't a case of them trying to save money by using a cheap component, but using it very well. The big thing, though, is that they decided to use a technique we'll get into in a minute. And that technique required more electricity. So unlike the NES or SNES running at 9 watts, Genesis ran at 12. And so that's going to have some very significant implications. But to give you an idea of how the main difference between these is simply that the Genesis has a bigger version of the same chip as a CPU, and also the same general hardware. All you need to play a Master System game on a Genesis is what was called the power base converter, which just fits the Master System square cartridge better, and also lowers the amount of electricity going into it. So it blocks about 2/3 of the energy running into the thing, and that enables you to play the old Master System games right on your Genesis. So they figured out how to do backwards compatibility, and also how to take advantage of the fact that it's basically the same system. Genesis was just a really well-designed SG-1000 or Master System. By this point, though, arcades have become more powerful, so Genesis could no longer handle them very well. But it could do a lot of other stuff and do it pretty well. And a lot of the reason for that is that it had 12 watts of power, and so that enabled it to run more functions than the NES or SNES. So it ran a lot faster because it had all that extra energy, and you could do more, you could get more out of all the components. They came up with a name for it. Now, the industry term that Sega had been using internally, and the technical term, is goosing it. So to goose it is to blast it with energy to get the maximum performance. Today, it's often called overclocking when it's done with PCs. But on console, it's still called goosing. But Sega figured out that goosing doesn't necessarily have the best ring to it, so they called it blast processing, because they're literally blasting their processor with energy. And so the idea is to get the absolute maximum out of the components in the system. And that's exactly what they get. So that's why Sega can run games that are so quick, like Sonic. Now, this is in many ways the true Master System. I would say that this is what Master System was always meant to be, what the SG-1000 was always intended to be. And so now it's finally available, and once it's available, American gamers latched onto it and bought a whole bunch of these things. And while I said it wasn't quite powerful enough to run the latest and greatest arcades, it could still run a lot of the old stuff really well, and if you account for the fact that it can't do the graphics you can get in a huge cabinet, then it still ran good home versions of those games. So what Sega did that Nintendo didn't was they just had 12 watts. As a hardware maker, Sega's specialty from the Master System with its cartridges on to every system they ever made is that they were really, really good about varying their energy use and using the goosing technique to the maximum impact. In fact, they were so good at managing energy that they actually released a couple years into the Genesis life cycle a Model 2 Genesis, which was smaller and cheaper to make. It also only used 8.5 watts. What's really brilliant about this is that although it uses a different energy level, it can run all the same games. It can also run the Master System Power Base Converter. And get this, it can also, both Model 1 and Model 2 Genesis units can also run the Model 1 or Model 2 Sega CD. So you can pair the old Genesis with the new Sega CD or vice versa. And both can also run the 32X, which is another later add-on. And so a lot of this is enabled by the fact that Sega knows how to make sure that the right amount of energy goes where it's needed. And the reason why the Model 2 could do what Model 1 could do but with less energy, which was the first time that's been the case, by the way, is what it does is it has an internal power reserve, a battery, which stores up energy and releases it from within. And that's also why you could only play the Model 2 for about 8 hours at a time before it would sort of start to overheat. But normally, back then, people didn't play games as long as they do now, so it was rarely an issue. So if you were a hardcore gamer, you'd need the Model 1, but for normal people, Model 2 was fine. So, anyway, this was just extraordinary as a piece of technology. Nobody else could do it. And once again, just like Nintendo stole the idea of repackaging a system, they also decided to steal goosing and using variable energy from Sega. And in fact, that was the key technology that they used for the Nintendo 64. And they knew that if they combined that technology with their existing cartridge technology, that they could get away with not doing research and development for CD-ROM. But we'll come back to that next week with the N64 and see that, in fact, Nintendo's going to give us the same thing for a third time. But for now, let's just focus on Sega, and also the 6-button controller, which was also compatible with Genesis. So even though Genesis already had its built-in limitations and was several years old, they were able to release a new controller with more buttons, which is something that had never happened before. And this could be compatible with any game on the system. So Sega was really, really good at compatibility and also varying voltage. According to Sega's internal plans, here is how they thought of all these systems. The SG-1000 was the Mark I, the original design. The Master System was the reconfigured Mark II. The Genesis Model 1 was therefore the Mark III. It was still effectively a Master System, but with the ability to goose. Then the Model 2 Genesis was the Mark IV. So this is just a streamlined, simplified version of the same thing. The Model 3, which was produced by some other company, actually reduced the size, weight, and energy use of the Genesis even more, but took away the compatibility with the Sega CD and 32X. That was known as the Mark V. And yes, it does count. I know a lot of people hate that system, but it does count, and Sega calls it the Mark V. So blame them, not me. Finally, the 32X is the Mark VI. And actually, at one point, Sega was going to release a thing called the Neptune, which was Genesis plus the 32X upgrades in it. And that would have run natively both Genesis and 32X games. But what 32X added to Genesis was just a little bit more graphic card. So it had another graphic card in it, it added more colors, and it could do some 3D stuff that Genesis had trouble with by itself. And of course, 32X wasn't around very long, and Neptune never came out. So the Mark VI is something that really barely happened. And again, the big proof of all this being the same system is that the SMS adapter for Genesis, the power base converter, works on any Genesis except for maybe the Model 3. But even then, I think it still works. Actually, you can put a power base converter on top of the 32X, and it will still work. But once again, the genius of Sega is that they were really, really, really talented at manipulating electricity in a way that no other company was. The downside to Sega is that they like to re-release the same stuff, and they gave Nintendo ideas, and they're the reason why Nintendo is still doing this practice this very day. So I would say thank you to Sega, but I'm not sure I can. Until next time, I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. Next week, when we come back, we'll look at the fraud Nintendo pulled off when they released the Nintendo 64, which it turns out was just the third time they had released the Nintendo Entertainment System.